Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. You're watching Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The World Day Against Trafficking in Persons is observed annually on July 30th to highlight the need to protect victims and survivors of trafficking, smuggling and forced labour. A shadow on this day for Malaysia is as we remain on the third tier, Tier 3 of the US State Department's annual Trafficking in Persons report for a second consecutive year. Tier 3 is the lowest grade, reserved for, quote, countries whose governments do not meet the minimum anti-trafficking standards and who are not making significant efforts to do so, end quote. In looking at it from a prosecution, protection and prevention perspective, would this be an accurate description of Putrajaya's efforts to address human trafficking and migrant smuggling crimes? Let's speak now to Edmund Bon. He's a lawyer and was previously the representative of Malaysia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights from 2016 to 2018. Edmund, thank you for joining us. Maybe you can begin our conversation today by helping us understand the legislation under which trafficking and smuggling crimes fall under, and how robust is this law?
Thank you, Melissa, for having me. It's sad that Malaysia has dropped to Tier 3, and if we are not careful, we're even going to go further down. I think there have been many efforts by civil society and government to try and improve law reform and to get the law strengthened. But I'm not sure why there is still so much resistance in actually doing it correctly. So there are two regimes. The first legal regime is the ATIPSOM, the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act that deals with trafficking in persons. The second regime is the employment regime, the Employment Act regime. So there is sometimes a conflation of forced labor cases as a trafficking case. And if it's a genuine forced labor case that meets the trafficking criteria requirements, then it should be prosecuted under the ATIPSOM Act. But if it's just a purely employment matter that can be dealt with by the labor officers, then it will be an employment matter. The problem really is that in many of the ATIPSOM prosecutions, the courts, and rightly so, have interpreted ATIPSOM and the provisions very strictly because they are criminal offenses. And a lot of the crimes and cases that come before the courts deal with forced labor. But because ATIPSOM has been drafted so badly originally, the Malaysian version, the courts are giving acquittals. So the government has strengthened it by making some amendments, but we say those amendments are not enough. And I think, unfortunately, the US TIP report is correct to say those things that for example, we have not prosecuted enough. Although we have strengthened the law, it's still not sufficient. And really, for me, there are a lot of forced labor cases which we have not recognized in Malaysian law. And that's something I do not know why government has really not legislated for forced labor as a criminal offense.
Can I ask you why? I mean, to posit perhaps reasons why, I don't quite understand. That means that forced labor cases are falling under the ATIPSOM Act when it should be a separate or looked at in a separate way. Are there gaps within the Employment Act that's not addressing the forced labor component?
Yes, of course. So Parliament just amended the Employment Act, included a definition of forced labor, but that is still not sufficient, because to show forced labor under the new amendment, the employee needs to show that he or she was physically restrained from leaving the place. That is not the only indicator for forced labor. There are 11 indicators of forced labor. The ILO has spelled out those indicators, and I just cannot understand why the government cannot legislate and say, look at these 11 indicators. That's in the law. The courts will say, okay, if there are any of these indicators, these are indicators of forced labor, and therefore forced labor in such a case is a crime. We have not recognized that.
Right. You mentioned, that this has often led to acquittals because the law is not robust. Can you explain? Can you share? Do you know what our conviction record is and who is being convicted?
I'm not privy to information because that information because government doesn't share that kind of information. But if you look at the US TIP report, it says that prosecutions have decreased. And I think we can see from the courts, this reason is because government and I think the AGC, I posit, was waiting for the amendments to come in. There has been a string of cases where the courts have given acquittals, and I think rightly so because the ATIP-SOM provisions has made it so difficult to prosecute, and the definitions in the ATIP-SOM Act were very unclear. So what we are actually trying to say is that if it's actually a genuine forced labor case, then you can still bring it under ATIP-SOM, but define it clearly, define forced labor clearly, and not make forced labor such an offense that it's so difficult to prove.
Right.
So
So
the
under ATIP-SOM that was amended recently, Edmund, the definition is still too loose, or the definition of coercion or forced labor is still too vague. Is that
yes,
right?
it's still too
Okay.
vague. There's still a conflation. I'm saying we cannot conflate it. So the only way prosecutors who want to prosecute forced labor cases and try and achieve a severe punishment would be to bring it under ATIP-SOM. But ATIP-SOM defines it as a more serious offense of trafficking. And when it comes before the courts will say, hey, I'm just making it very simplistic. This is a forced labor case. This is not a trafficking case. Therefore, I will not be able to convict the accused person under the more severe punishment for ATIP-SOM.
Okay, which explains why in the report it does mention that the continued conflation between human trafficking and migrant smuggling crimes was highlighted. Can I ask you? I remember reading that there was a special court set up to address smuggling crimes, the same way there were special courts to set up for sexual crimes for children, against children. What happened to that? Is that still ongoing? And do we know how many cases are brought to the court, are heard in the court?
Yeah, I think the courts are still sitting. There is a specialized unit also in the AGC for these type of cases in the Sessions Court. I don't have the numbers for these cases, but from the case reports that we have surveyed, we have done research on it. A lot of the courts in West and East Malaysia, rightly so, have defined the pre-amendment ATIP-SOM provisions and defined it in such a way that it's so difficult to achieve prosecutions. So in essence, normatively, the ATIP-SOM does not protect victims and survivors of forced labor.
Okay. There was also, you mentioned at the beginning, the resistance to law reform or legal reform. What I'm also sensing is there's also a certain defensiveness about this report, saying that it is an American perspective, that it's a very subjective look at Malaysia's record on on trafficking in persons. Where would you see the push coming from, if not from government through policy and through legislation?
I think the government has, for many years, in the initial periods when the TIP reports were coming out, government for many years was quite defensive. But with the setting up of MAPO and I think the new different teams that come within MAPO, we can see on the ground there were greater consultations on ATIP-SOM. There were genuine attempts to amend ATIP-SOM. But unfortunately, again, we said it recently in a consultation, a lot of the amendments that we want have not been put in. So if government is not prepared to put it in, we just have to accept those consequences. It's difficult to say, that the TIP report is completely wrong. It's been there for so many years, and I think internally there are people in government that genuinely want to amend the law, and they would say, yes, I think we quite agree with the TIP report, but publicly they would say something else. So I'm not going to go into that, but I think we look at the legal issues. I give you another example. There's so much publicity about recruitment fees.
Mm.
We should talk about making recruitment fees illegal. We should talk about how do we do human rights due diligence for recruitment agencies, before these agencies can go and recruit migrant workers from source countries. Why are we not talking about those things? The third thing we're talking about, we've proposed this amendment to MAPO, transparency in supply chains. Why don't we make mandatory due diligence reporting an obligation for certain large companies who have large supply chains? They must, before they can export their goods, before they can sell their goods, they need to have a report that their supply chain is free of forced labor, so that we stop getting the bad publicity where we try and export goods and America sends withhold orders against us. We are not looking at those things. So these three simple, well, no, it's not simple, but these three amendments have been made many times. And when government does not accept these amendments, we still do not understand why. They say, okay, we are not ready, or let's take one step at a time. But we've been hearing this for many years. And if we fall down the ladder, as we have seen now, what else do we want to say?
Edmund, thank you so much for bringing up those points and appreciate your time sharing your insights on this show. Thank you. Lawyer Edmund Bondet, and we're going to take a quick break here on Consider This. We will be back with more. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. Let's continue our look at Putrajaya's efforts to address human trafficking, migrant smuggling and forced labour crimes. This as Malaysia has once again been given the lowest rank in the annual US Trafficking in Persons report for the second consecutive year. Tier 3 is the lowest grade. It's reserved for countries whose governments do not fully meet the minimum anti-trafficking standards and who are not making significant efforts to do so, as per the report. Joining us now, we have Alex Ong. He is the country representative for the NGO Migrant Care. Alex, thank you for being on the show tonight. What do you make of Malaysia being kept on Tier 3? I mean, the government seems to say that they have taken action in tackling human trafficking. They've set up the council, the Anti-Trafficking Persons Council. They've set up amendments to the law. They've set up the National Action Plan on Anti-Trafficking. Yet it doesn't seem to be good enough to move us up in the ranking. What are your thoughts on this?
Good evening, Melissa. Thank you for inviting me to this event. First and foremost is certainly when we look into the anti-human trafficking tiering rated by the US State Department, it seems like Malaysia and US may have a different value judgment system that we look at the matter. As far as the what we call anti-human trafficking effort itself, we have seen a lot of rhetorics, what we call statement, a lot of paperwork being done. But what actually happened on the ground, we are still at the stage of self-denial of the policy implementation gap, policy efficacy gaps, and what is done is actually the symbolic policy gesture, which actually is only what we do is only just to please the international community of what we intend to do. And if you look at the National Action Plan on forced labor, it's already entering the second year. But we seem like this is just another piece of paper, which is actually written to show the world that we are doing something on it. And if you look at the anti-human trafficking law, which was introduced in 2007, but come into implementation in the year 2011, there was actually a big gap year of 5 years, 4 to 5 years. It seems like nothing could happen when you just have it on the paper. And then if we look into the what we call the real implementation of the MAPO, Malaysia Anti-Human Trafficking Council itself, we still have a lot of what we call bureaucratic politics among our agency. For example, Human Resources Ministry, they have their own value judgment and they have their own KPI. Home Affairs, they do have their own standard, where actually all the agency, even though put into one room, but they have a different KPI, and they do not actually try to achieve the common goal of fighting human trafficking. This is actually something which is actually a very serious issue. Why we actually fail in terms of implementing it.
Right, that's very interesting because the report also cites this insufficient interagency cooperation. I thought that was the point of having MAPO, of having the Council on Anti-Trafficking being headed by the Home Ministry. The idea is to have an overarching look at all the different moving parts in tackling trafficking in persons.
Yeah, if I look into the experience that I have in dealing with MAPO, police is actually more interested in crime busting on the criminal aspect of it, while the labor department is only interested onto the industrial relationship in solving the industrial relation dispute. And when they come together, it seems like they are not synchronizing each other's effort. And when we come to what we call, for example, which I hate to mention, is actually the bureaucratic politics between the MOHR and the Ministry of Home Affairs, where actually when Home Affairs was a Ministry of Human Resources was given the mandate by the cabinet to become the lead agency to implement the MOU. Yeah, I call it the April Fool Day Memorandum of Understanding, because it was signed on the April Fool Day. It seems like there are a lot of blunder happened there, that actually the bureaucratic what we call politics happened between these two agencies. And being an agency appointed by the cabinet, they should take the prominent lead in determining the country's what we call direction in fighting anti-human trafficking. While on the other hand, if you follow the development, first was actually minister who signed the MOU, what we call try to ignore the minimum wage regime, where actually he only recognized the 1,200 instead of 1,005, which is signed by in the MOU. And then there was also a denier of the what we call the mid online system, which has been sensitive since 2016. And then is the minister probably been advised by the director of the JDK itself in addressing to the situation. And then when the things happen, when we already signed the MOU, that is actually the time for revision in July. However, when it happened, it seems like the what we call Home Affairs is still continue with the mid online regime, while the leading agency is still looking for excuse of not to be responsible for what happened at the Ministry of Home Affairs there. So this actually show a very strong political what we call bureaucratic politics over there, where actually agency do not actually try to find the solution to resolve it. As far as what we call putting blame on Indonesia is a very easy thing to mention, but if you look at who are the source country that send migrant worker to Malaysia, we can look at Nepal, we can look at Bangladesh, and we can look at Indonesia. Which country is actually in one accord with Malaysia's policy? For example, Bangladesh recently actually pushed forward about this what we call of the constraint of the number of the agency involved. It seems like they are selective 20 only, while Nepal traditionally is also having an issue on this matter. So beside Nepal and Indonesia and Bangladesh, where else can we go in filling up our labor market gap? So in this particular situation, when there's a gap issue, that the labor market in Malaysia will still have their demand and supply of the worker. So with this particular situation, it has created a vacuum that we need worker to sustain our economy. For example, if we look at the plantation sector itself, I think I attended one seminar in Nottingham was mentioning that from the Ministry of Commodity that mentioned that we are losing 1.4 billion a month on the unharvested fruit. So that actually translated into about 46 million per day that the industry is losing the money. We haven't mentioned about the construction sector, manufacturing sector, and other SME. So what went wrong here? So whenever we have what we call the labor deficit here, there definitely we will need the what we call the supply that come in to fill up the gap. So once the country do not into agreement into this particular policy matter where MOU is taken as a joke, and definitely a lot of job seeker from the poverty country, they will find means and way to enter into Malaysia. So this actually has created the undesired human smuggling and human trafficking activities being going on. According to what we call the estimations of the former Tenaga Nita director, Irene Fernandez was mentioning, that was back about 6-7 years ago. This particular market itself is about 7 billion US dollar per year. It's a very lucrative market to bring in the people as a trafficking victim as well as the smuggling victim. So
So the incompetencies of government in trying to iron out the details of MOUs on labor is actually fueling the anti-trafficking and migrant smuggling black market and exacerbating the problem. Alex, I do want to ask you, I mean, when you talk about the implementation gaps, the policy implementation gaps, what is it that you would like to see? Because you, as an activist, as a migrant rights, labor rights activist, you see the repercussions on the ground. You see the repercussions to the victims and the survivors. What would you like to see immediately and urgently addressed?
From my perspective, is actually first and foremost, most of the people who advise the minister, they don't have the capacity to do that. Whether the minister don't listen to them, or they are actually like take it easy and too complacent with the Malaysian situation in what we call always talk about Malaysia's sovereignty right rather than Malaysia as a global community. So as this particular part itself, we have to correct the whole institutional structure by changing the top bureaucrat who actually cannot deliver the result, because the Malaysia cannot afford to lose out on the incapable leadership over here. For example, when the what we call when the cabinet appointed you as the implementation agent, you're given the mandate by our prime minister to make sure that you deliver the result. As far as the what we call human trafficking case among the Indonesian community here is always there. Of course, we cannot deny it, but we can always reduce it if we have a good leader who has a good competency in communicating with other agency as well. For example, what's went wrong with the two leading ministry? Are they not in the communication, and are they having a different way of looking at things? This must be shortened up, must be ironed out. Not just finding the excuse who is right or who is wrong. We only have one Malaysia, what we call agenda to achieve, rather than my JTK agenda or your KDN agenda. So this is at least something which we need to address. Especially we cannot always in the stage of denial and always finding fault at other agency.
Well, what about the private sector then, Alex? The inaptitude of governments and agencies may be exploited by the private sector, who see it as a loophole to continue forced labor practices, to continue really unsavory labor practices. What can be done to ensure that the private sector, the employers, are not let off the hook?
Actually, you have a very good question here, especially when we look into the private, what we call the employer itself. For them, is survival of their business, survival of our economy. We can, especially for example, in the hotel industry itself, we are actually in shortage of more than 50,000 housekeeping workforce over there. And then hotel industry itself is an industry that do not churn out product. Everything is based on the service. They cannot afford to wait until government decided the idealistic solution. They have to make the decision to ensure that the hotel survive, because day in day out they have to bear the expenses of the bank interest to support the salary scheme and all this sort of thing. If the hotel cannot go into full swing, then they will be dying. So this is actually the situation of the structural issue about our agency, which actually is killing our industry. If you look at the what we call the palm oil industry itself, 1.4 billion a month is a big number. 46 million a day, it is something where actually you can feed, I would say that at least 100 of a director general. Yeah, and this is something which actually we don't have the sense of urgency, and we must correct this particular paradigm. Of course, it's easy to find the what we call the problem with the employer itself. Employer have their own set of problem, because during COVID they are facing the problem of the what we call lockdown,
Lockdown.
and then they do not have they have to cut down the working days of the worker, and then they have so many repatriation going back, and then the policymakers still reluctant to bring in, and because due to the what we call disagreement on the MOU itself, uh, how can we actually keep on finding fault on the employer who actually
Right.
need to support our economy and paying tax continuously and also service their loan? So employer definitely will have to find way to survive, whether it is through the what we call in the structural way or unstructural way.
Right. Alex, thank you for joining us on the show. Alex Ong, country representative for the for Migrant Care, which is an NGO that looks after migrant labour rights. And that wraps up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.